Hello and welcome everybody to our next quarterly webinar here at the Coalition for the Registration of Exercise Professionals. Super excited to have you join us. And so today's topic we're going to be talking about is addressing military recruitment challenges and the role of exercise professionals in helping kind of resolve the problem. So a little quick background, kind of like what we're going to be talking about and kind of like the panel discussion. The U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force are grappling with recruitment challenges as only 23% of young Americans are qualified to serve. And the number of showing interest continues to decline. The declining numbers pose a significant hurdle in meeting enlistment goals for the foreseeable future. And as a result, the U.S. is facing a national security crisis that must be addressed directly. And so our esteemed panelists today are going to be walking through some opportunities of really kind of defining what the problem is, I think is one, what we can do as exercise professionals addressing the problem, and really kind of the third one is like into the future of what's next. And so if you have any questions during this panel discussions, we're going to go about 45 minutes on the questions and answers. And then, 45 minutes on the kind of the panel discussion, but we would love to have your feedback from the audience. And so on the very bottom of your screen, use the Q&A function that's there to type in your questions. We'll answer those at the end of the presentation, the last 15 minutes. This webinar is going to be recorded. As soon as we're done, it's going to be sent to anybody who's registered for the session, and it'll be posted on the CREP's YouTube channel. And so without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our panels to kind of give a quick introduction to themselves and kind of who they are. Dr. Bornstein, you can go first.
Hi, Francis. Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks to US Reps for hosting this conversation. Very important conversation. My name is Dan Bornstein. I'm the founding principal of a consulting company called D. Bornstein Solutions, LLC. Couldn't come up with a more creative name than that. But it's a company that works at the intersection of fitness, health, and national security. Prior to this, I was on the faculty at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, in the Department of Health and Human Performance. And I also wear a hat as the chair of the military settings sector for the U.S. National Physical Activity Plan. I'm delighted to be here and among this group of esteemed panelists. Thank you very much.
Dr. Joe.
All right, hi. I'm Joe Cardoni. Currently, I'm serving as the director of the Tactical Performance Group at Georgia Southern University. That's a new collaborative research group, soon to be a research group, and we have some academic programs as well. I'm coming off a 24-year career in the Army, and my last job in the Army was serving as an advisor to the Force Comm surgeon on matters related to human performance, musculoskeletal injury, and rehabilitation. And I'm clinically trained as a physical therapist and have held several positions throughout my military career, ranging from the clinic to research and development in the human performance and injury fields. And then as a director of human performance optimization for 18th Airborne Corps before going to Forces Command.
And sorry, Joe.
Oh, no, I was going to thank you for having us here, Francis, and certainly pass that along so Nate can introduce himself.
Awesome.
Sweet. So I'd like to echo the thank you. Really appreciate you hosting us here today. Nate Palin. I am currently the director of education for a nonprofit called Soldiers to Sidelines. We essentially provide a journey for the military community to become character-based coaches within their own community. And then I also run a business called Any Given Day that essentially marries the idealism of the human performance world with the reality within the tactical profession specific to warfighters. Formerly, I ran the NSCA's tactical program. Prior to that, was a strength and conditioning coach within special operations, and long since removed, but former Army Ranger.
Very good. Mark?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. So, Francis, thanks for having us. So I'm a project officer with the Armed Forces Wellness Center. I'm stationed out of Fort Liberty, and I've been all over the United States with the AFWCs. I've been at Fort Leonard Wood, where I started, went to Fort Irwin for a little bit, and then came out here as a director. I also serve with Maryville University as an adjunct professor in the exercise science program, and prior to that, 10 years in the U.S. Army.
Very good. So I guess it's like, so my name is Francis. I'm the Associate Vice President of Certification and Credentialing here at the American College of Sports Medicine. That's my day job, and I'm the current president of the Coalition for the Registration of Exercise Professionals. Really kind of a collaboration between a number of organizations like ECSM, NSCA, CSCCA, and others. I think in terms of kind of like the certification programs and really trying to position exercise professionals as they're uniquely qualified to improve health and well-being of our communities, regardless of where they are. So that's really kind of our purpose. So I think kind of going back to the purpose of the call, it would be really awesome, Dan, if you can provide us kind of a high level 30,000 foot view of kind of where did we get here. So if we don't do anything about addressing the challenges of recruitment and kind of like in the national security threat, how did we get here?
It's a good question. It's been a long road. In this case, Rome wasn't created in a day, and it won't be fixed in a day either. But if we go back probably 15, 20 years from just a sort of a public health perspective, we began recognizing just how critical physical activity, nutrition, obesity were to public health. But more recently, we've begun looking at the impact that those same things, physical inactivity, obesity, poor nutrition, are having on the military. Not only those who are in the military, but really across the entire pipeline, from recruitment all the way through active duties or military status and into the veteran population. And as you mentioned earlier, Francis, we are having some very serious recruiting challenges right now. So we have a population of young Americans that's largely just not fit enough to serve. One statistic recently from the CDC, a study that we did that really just looked at being fit enough to serve. There are a number of reasons why somebody may not be able to serve in the military. And those could include things related to health, but also could include things like not having a high school diploma or having a criminal record, things like that. So that number is up around 73%. But when you just isolate quote unquote fit enough to serve, roughly 60% of age eligible Americans are not fit enough to serve. So that in and of itself is a problem. We don't have enough people coming in. The Army fell short of its recruiting goal last year by 15,000 soldiers. And if we don't start fixing the problem, meaning not only at the front end from a recruiting perspective, but also once we have service members in the door, we'll talk about musculoskeletal injuries and the challenges they pose. The reality is that we will have a weak military and it will become weaker. And as we face near-peer adversaries like China, if we go to battle with them, there's a higher likelihood that we will lose. And it's really that real and it's that dire. So that's sort of a little bit about how we got to where we are.
I guess the question for Dan and Mark, when we're thinking about the recruiting challenges, is this really just a problem of identifying folks that are physically able to do the job, or what are your thoughts there? So let me ask that question to Dan, to Nate first, and kind of what your thoughts are. Just kind of like, is it just like, look, there's not enough people that are active, and we just need to get people more active to start? And kind of what are your thoughts there from a recruiting side?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you said, are we just talking about those not fit enough to serve? I think to Dan's point, he started to allude to the idea of getting further upstream. And I think that's really the ultimate goal here, right? So we can talk about what we're implementing within the armed forces. We can talk about what happens between recruitment and basic training, or even some of what's existing now with the creation of essentially these camps, right, where they're trying to get people that last little bit that they need to be eligible. But obviously, these are all still extremely downstream solutions. And so we have to zoom out, we have to look upstream, and we have to look at what's going on culturally across the entire country that's leading folks to this point of being of the age to serve, but not ready to serve from a physical perspective.
What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point when we start talking about getting people ready to serve. And it sort of brings some conversation that I will bring up again later on, probably. It brings us back to an educational standpoint. We have to educate family members. We have to educate the force. We have to educate, individuals that are going through our elementary, our junior highs and into high school, and to get them mentally prepared for, what does health look like overall? And what can you do with that, right? Because in high schools these days, you might have one class at one high school in one county that is actually teaching holistic health principles or nutritional principles for those individuals. And we see it all the time. Individuals can't join And the reason for that is they just aren't educated enough across the board. So if we can teach our force, and then they can teach the family members, we can reach the families, and then it can sort of spread. We can get more educated individuals on this health sphere, I will say. Then that right there is going to allow us a better force for the future. Over.
So I think one question, I think I had one follow-up question to Nate, and then we'll go to Joe about his perspective. But I think, what are your thoughts on kind of like when we're talking about, I guess, the balance of culture, I think is one, and then Dan's kind of talking about from a public health perspective. It seems like that there's the two camps of peak athleticism, and then when we're talking about elite level kind of training, and then public health, just like there aren't folks who are just actually generally physically active. What are your thoughts on those two camps of like, is there a shift to one over the next? And kind of, that seems like that would be kind of hard to square it up. Kind of, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think what you're recognizing is this polarization toward extremes, right? And we know that this isn't just specific to physicality within our society, but if you think about it from, let's say, youth sport perspective, right? At one end of the issue, we have folks who are playing, same sport year round, early and deep specialization, and we know that that's not necessarily the best thing to go, right? So we're really pushing the pinnacle of like peak performance, or at least conceptually we are. And then on the other extreme, you have complete dormancy, right? So total inactivity. And it's almost like there needs to be this meeting in the middle of just general activity, which would better support, obviously the concept of public health. And really it would better support a candidate, say, for the military. And then this might not be the best place to add this, but I'm going to throw it in quickly, is we see some of this too with, say, special operations, right? Where there's this assumption that everybody is all in and too much and all the time hard charger. And that's just not really the reality. It's certainly not the reality in the military setting. And it's honestly not even the reality within special operations. For most folks, what we need is more consistency and just to pull them out of those two extremes.
That's super helpful. And so I guess the question goes to Joe and kind of your physical therapy background and kind of what you've done. How do injuries play into the challenge of the recruitment? And then I guess, for a lack of a better term, retention. I wanted to kind of pose that to you. It's like, now understanding there's few people that are doing it or physically active. How does that play into kind of injuries and kind of the long-term health and well-being of folks?
Right. Now that we have fewer people who are actually qualified to serve, I mean, attrition becomes a much bigger factor. If we're losing people needlessly, then we need to try and figure out a way that we can address the problem. But when we're having folks come in, just looking at what's already been mentioned about general overall fitness and health, when you have folks come into the military to their initial training environments and they're healthier and a little bit more fit, then they're more likely to be able to succeed in that environment. And that's it's just qualifying people to be, meet the minimums to serve, right? So we're not training operators or special elite forces during basic training. You just want people to come in, become acclimated to being in the service, and then go on for other training. So coming in with that general level of fitness that will allow you to withstand the rigors of training, understanding that injuries happen sometimes in our environment, and we try and get folks back to condition as quickly as possible. But we want to avoid those overuse injuries, those stress injuries, where people are coming in just really not acclimated to the exercise or being on their feet as much as they will be when they enter the environment. And then you're looking at attrition. And really a lot of the statistics that you're seeing in the operational force is how many people attrit after that first term of service. And there can be a lot of reasons, not just the physical reasons. And Nate kind of alluded to some of those as he was going through, but how we help people maintain the right level of mental resiliency, how we take care of their needs or teach them to take care of their needs spiritually, or whatever the case may be, but really getting folks acclimated, giving them the tools or helping to educate them, whatever the case may be, so they're more likely to continue to serve. Because then if we can get these folks to stay in beyond their initial term of service, then that recruitment burden becomes a little bit less too.
So it really sounds like this is a big shift to looking at the whole person versus just like you get bogged down by just pure doctrine, like this is the way we program, this is the way we exercise, and we're really considering meeting the needs of folks where they are. And I know, Mark, you alluded to kind of like, how do we move the needle through education? Because I know that you had a real strong interest in kind of like looking at the H2S model and bringing it back to education. What are your thoughts on there and having enough people to be able to deliver that type of service?
I think Joe just hit it on the head. It's not just about the recruiting aspects, it's about the retention aspects as well. And I think it's big on, we have to get back to the basis of education. If we start looking at, you mentioned H2F, the 7-22 is the Holistic Health and Fitness Manual, and it states in there that all leaders are trainers, but not all leaders in the military have that basic understanding of exercise, that we do as exercise professionals. So as exercise professionals, whether it's strength coaches or exercise physiologists or personal trainers, nutritionists, we have to get back to the basics. So whenever we're talking the NCO level, the non-commissioned officers, we have to teach at the BLCs, those basic leader courses, the advanced leaders courses, the senior leader courses. And we have to meet those master fitness trainers for the units that have them, train them, allow them, to train the units. Because here on Fort Liberty alone, I am not going to reach 138,000 beneficiaries myself and my team at the Armed Forces Wellness Center. But there are multiple teams with H2F. We have our Thor counterparts here. We have health promotion. And if we can collectively get together, understand what each other is teaching, and then push that same message out across the field, I believe we can have a base understanding of, where to start and then start moving forward. So I'll go, and I think Nate was going to jump in after that.
Dan.
Yeah. Thanks, Nate. I just wanted to follow up, Francis, on what Mark was saying from an educational perspective and the role of exercise professionals. Without a doubt, there's a really important role for exercise professionals within military environments to help be champions and be educators. We know from public health that we're largely creatures of our environment. So if our environment really isn't helping support us in being physically active and eating healthfully and sleeping well and taking proper care of ourselves, it can be very hard to overcome some of those environmental challenges, whether that's sort of the physical environment, the social environment, or maybe even the policy environment. But I would also say exercise professionals, we have a role if we're working with military populations. Obviously, it's within our professional scope to be those champions and those educators, but also getting back sort of upstream, like Nate was talking about earlier. I think we have a moral obligation, if not a professional one, within the communities in which we live, given the recruiting challenges that we have, to be the advocates for changes to the policy systems and environments where we all live and work and play, and where our kids go to school and so on, so that we really can try to create this cultural shift, both within the military and in our culture overall, that yes, is going to help improve military readiness for sure, and is going to improve the overall health of our nation. So I think the education piece is critical. And I think, exercise professionals have a real important role to play as champions for change, whether they're working in a military environment and or just their local environment.
Absolutely. And I think one of the big things here when we're thinking about kind of certification and kind of the roles of different things like education, certification, lifelong learning, each one of those plays a critical role. And it really kind of depends on what type of audience you're working with. So when we think about education, and I think Mark, you said it, and Dan, you've said it, it's just like, where are you starting from? What do they need to know in order to be safe and effective as insert job? Because if you talk about somebody who's coming from a degree, an exercise science degree at, say, Georgia Southern or Cal State Long Beach or whatever, what do you need to know in order to work with a certain population? I think that's one. That's where you're starting from. That's the role of education. Certification itself is just like, how do you know, independent of where you learn, that you are safe and effective enough? And then lifelong learning, how does that grow with you as a professional? So you think about the workforce development side. And really in this particular audience, when you're describing, people are coming in at different areas, like the civilians are coming in with exercise science degree, and those who are kind of the group fitness leaders are coming in with, it's like, look, I understand the culture of the military, but I don't have an exercise science background. And so it seems like that's an opportunity from an educational perspective, like how can we help you get to where you need to be to administer types of programs you're looking for? So I do want to zoom out just a little bit. I think, Dan, that would be really helpful is to have a better understanding for our audience of what is H2F? Kind of what is the role and purpose of it in kind of addressing kind of recruitment issues and kind of the life, I think in kind of the lifespan of kind of where we're going.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. So Mark alluded to it earlier. Field Manual 7-22 is the U.S. Army's attempt at implementing DoD policy, Department of Defense policy, called total force fitness. And the basic idea there is that, yes, we're looking at beyond just the physical. We're looking at multiple different domains of what it means to be a human being, and a human being that can perform minimally all the way up to optimally. So that's what H2F, or holistic health and fitness, is. It's the Army's take on the DoD's total force fitness. And Mark can speak much more to exactly how that's being implemented across the Army. It's still very much in its early phase, but in essence, some have called it the single greatest human performance optimization initiative ever. And I would actually zoom back out and say it's probably the most ambitious public health initiative ever. It really is public health. It's really helping, again, create the environment so that our service members have access to healthy food, have access to great opportunities to be physically active, which we would think is pretty regular in the military, but not always. Opportunities to get access to mental health services and cognitive coaches and physical therapists, all of those different things. That's in essence what H2F is implementing teams of professionals to help support the team of service members who need to do a job.
Mark, what are your thoughts on that? I think you've alluded to about being H2F being a lifestyle. What are your thoughts on that?
So when I think of H2F, well, let me back up a little bit. When most people hear the term H2F, we think of the H2F teams, and H2Fs here in Fort Liberty, you're going to have 10 different teams that have anywhere between 30 to 38 individuals, ranging from strength coaches to physical therapists, registered dietitians, that work with individual brigades. Now, in the grand scheme of things, the Army's, I think in the end, we're going to roughly have about 50% of the units tasked to have those H2F brigade entities that are solely funded within those brigades. Now, the rest of the Army has to look at other avenues. So we have our military treatment facilities, we have our armed forces wellness centers, our health promotion programs. And then outside of the Army as itself, you have operational support teams in the Air Force, you have health promotion programs in the Air Force, the Navy has other programs. So we have to look at this as not just an H2F endeavor, because as you read FM 7-22, it specifically relates to those H2F teams and how they are going to sharpen that tip of the spear within those brigades that they work for. But there's multiple organic H2Fs that are occurring everywhere. We work with a couple non-H2F organizations here on Fort Liberty with the Armed Forces Wellness Centers, and we serve in a role as those strength coaches, as the health educators, and we help individuals that do not have those resources to strengthen those units as well. So we have to look at it as a holistic approach to mental readiness, right? We have to look at sleep readiness. We have to look at individual stress management, because everyone has that focus on the physicality, when it's not just physicality. It's not just getting out there and scoring a 600 on the ACFT. Sometimes they come in and it's a stress component that we have to work with to get them back in the fight. Sometimes we think it's nutrition when truly it is, a sleep thing. So I think if we back off a little bit and say, okay, it's not just physical activity that we have to worry about, we can really grasp, where we start and how we assist these individuals when they come into the offices, and then how we address this at the organizational level.
Hey, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mark's nailing it. And really, I see, I spoke on this at the H2F symposium this year, where physicality is really the breach, right? And so it's a common language that everybody has some level of understanding and appreciation for. And so a lot of times it can be the way that we wedge our foot into the door. But once we've created a little bit of space in that door, that's a perfect opportunity for us to start sneaking in these other components of what we're referring to as H2F. And on that same front, I love that Mark talks about H2F being a lifestyle and a concept, right? A global concept that defies even the walls of the military. And to Dan's point, right? It's a public health initiative. Instead of just thinking it as a program, because when we think of it as a program, everybody's waiting for H2F to show up on their doorstep, but that's not the way it works. Like, you are, as an individual, embodying whatever H2F is at your independent level, right? And the other part of it is, like, when you think of it as a program, then you think of it as, we wrote a big check and we employed a whole bunch of people and a whole bunch of assets, and they're going to come fix the problem. You can't write a check big enough to fix a culture problem. The way that you overcome that is you lead your way out of it, right? And you make adjustments to, say, policy that then, to Dan's earlier point, start to affect the environment. So you create an environment that's conducive to growth in holistic health and fitness.
I'm going to ask this question, and it's going to be a kind of like, I guess it's like poking the bear a little bit for all of you. And I'd love to hear your feedback. Depending on where you are and kind of like your particular role in embodying this, what is the biggest challenge that you see in your particular position in implementing this as a cultural shift? So I guess let me ask that to Dan, but I'd love to hear from Mark, Joe, and Nate about what is your particular challenge of trying to do this. So we'll start with Dan first.
So thanks, Francis. I think so what I'm going to put my sort of my position as the chair of the military setting sector for the National Physical Activity Plan. I'm going to put that hat on.
Yeah. And
say that I think we've talked about education, and I'm going to talk about it in terms of educating policymakers and leaders. So, Nate properly, I think, said we have to lead our way out of this. So I think a big part of the imperative is helping our lawmakers, literally the individuals who have their hands on the purse strings of the National Defense Authorization Act, the things that are paying for these programs. And I know, Nate, we want to think of them as more than just programs, but we want to ensure that our lawmakers and policymakers within the military do really understand and appreciate the importance of what in the military is called the human weapon system, the human being, and that we have to make that part of the arsenal a real priority. And the reality is it hasn't been a priority for way too long. And given the recruiting, as we talked about earlier, given the recruiting challenges that we have, the retention piece, as Joe said, becomes huge. And if we don't properly resource it, meaning educate lawmakers, educate senior military leaders on the things that they can be doing to support these programs and every single service member and their families, then it's going to be a really long, hard uphill battle. So part of my job is to help continue to do some of that research and translate that research into policy advocacy at the federal level. So that's where I see it from.
How about yourself, Joe?
So I'm transitioning from the active duty side and now to the civilian sector. So I'm seeing it through two different lenses, kind of simultaneously as I transition. And our biggest problems, as you were asking about, Francis, or obstacles to overcome as we were implementing H2F across Forces Command, was initially it was like, hey, here's 25 to 35 extra people, and they're going to help your unit, and you're dumping them on the unit, and the unit doesn't understand what's happening in its entirety, right? And you have the doctrine of 7-22 that describes holistic health and fitness, but now you have all these professionals coming into this organization, into an organization that wasn't used to having them. So initially there was this, we need to have that culture change where they were accepting of these folks, and they were for the most part, and then realizing how they could help everyone become better versions of themselves. So initially it was getting folks to accept these new teams and what they were going to do and provide to the unit and the soldiers, and how the soldiers themselves could also leverage the expertise of all these folks that are now in their formation to help broaden the knowledge base of everybody and the health and fitness of everyone. And then what we saw is, as that culture started to take hold, the opposite, the script flipped. It was, as Mark alluded to, or Mark said directly, about half the Army is going to get these H2F resources organic to the unit, right? And then the units who didn't have them saw what the others had, and the positive benefits that were coming about. And now they're clamoring for the same resources. And now everyone wants this resource, which is a good problem to have. I think we really wanted to get there. So now you're seeing different variations. Mark described several of them. We have other organizations within the Army and funded by the DoD that can help out in these realms to help the mental, spiritual, physical performance and everyone improve their nutritional intake. And then now seeing it from the civilian side. Now, how do we help this out from the civilian sector? I think it's really a more natural transition than we think. We have all these disciplines organic to these larger universities working in this space. And now I see it as being collaborative with the DoD entities and helping the research and development side. And having been on the research and development side within the Army, some of us used to say that it was, we're big on R and little on D. We had lots of research, lots of bench work. We'd find out the mechanisms behind lots of problems and how you need to adjust some things physiologically, but the development side, the translational side of the research wasn't as well developed. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of these other organizations who can come in and, Dan's part of that and everything. So you're trying to get these these translational products where you're taking all this now research and bench work and putting it into something that now the practitioners can put into use and help their clients. So I usually go clients rather than patients. I've brought up as a PT, refer to everyone as a patient, but I think it goes beyond that. I think folks are our clients now.
Love to hear your feedback, Nate, on that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that Dan brought up kind of leading from wherever you're at, right? So that could mean that you are educating somebody who is in a policy-making position, in a leadership position, et cetera. And so I think that what we are battling is there's two camps here. There's one who's willing to own it, and they're going to do what they can to educate and lead from wherever they are in every direction possible. So however they can be influential, they will. And then the other side is the enemy here, which is apathy, right? And so you have the apathetic camp, which includes, by the way, plenty of people in very high level leadership positions who are unwilling to own this and to leverage all of these resources that are at their disposal. There is not a lack of resources. There are not a lack of programs. There are entities within the DoD, outside of the nonprofit space, in private sector business, academia, et cetera, right? Like they are everywhere if you're willing to be aggressive and leverage them and include them to solve a problem that you recognize exists. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of folks who are in denial about the state of the force.
I'm sort of tie everyone together with that right there. And it goes back to buy-in. We have to figure out how we can get buy-in, not only from the lowest private on these installations, but to the most senior leaders in the DoD. Because when you look at it, and I'm going to steal what Nate said, you can't write a big enough check for this. The average personal trainer has anywhere between 25 to 50 clients if they're a full-time personal trainer. And that's a heavy load for most people. And that's if you're a really, really good personal trainer. Strength coaches, it's going to be a little bit less. Your exercise physiologist, we do a little bit different stuff. But when we're training and we're trying to move the needle on education and take care of the force, there are so many people that we're trying to educate and, raise up across the board. I think the biggest thing for us is we have to use our resources. There are so many individuals, and I was one. I started my exercise science degree whenever I was in the military, but I wasn't utilized for that. My company commanders knew that I cared about it, but they selected other people to go to the master fitness trainer courses who really didn't care. They were just using it as promotion potential. So we have to utilize the individuals that we have. We've always said, do more with less. Well, there's individuals within those ranks that can assist us, especially in those non-H2F units. So use the individuals that we have that can generate some of that internal organic buy-in with those units. And then I think we're going to start moving forward if we can figure out a way to do that. Over.
I'd love to hear from all of you in a different way now. So you're able to speak to our different audience groups by our membership organizations. We have about 165,000 certified professionals across the United States. And so from job roles, from group exercise instructors, personal trainers, through exercise physiologists, strength conditioning coaches, and clinical exercise physiologists. And how do they get involved? Like if we're talking about, like, you're talking to them directly and they want to be involved with being able to do changes in public health and perception, et cetera, how can an exercise professional get involved with the movement that you guys are describing? Because it sounds like an exciting time in being able to change lives and kind of in not only for soldiers, but just being able to change lives of communities. So how can we get involved at our organizations? And I'll let anybody who wants to answer that one.
I'll jump in. Well, if others want to gather their thoughts, I think there are a couple different ways. What we see are a lot of initially, if you just want to get involved and test the water, so to speak, there are a lot of volunteer efforts, and we see a lot of different organizations, particularly on the academic side, who develop these programs and reached out to their local military organizations or tactical organizations of other types, and instituted these volunteer programs where the staff at the university, graduate students, engage in community relations and help develop programs that address the needs of the DoD populations. But if you're looking at maybe perhaps looking at this as a career, there are several avenues of approach. If you're looking at if you're someone who wants to be in uniform, there may be some academic programs that you can enter under service contract and enter the military. We have several of those, whether it be physician assistant, physical therapy, occupational therapy, nutrition, of various forms where you can do that. There are also, since we are recruiting all of these people to come into these formations, we have active duty folks, we have government civilians, so they're civilian employees for the DoD or the U.S. government, and we have contractors. So there are different mechanisms that you can come in and work with these populations. If you want to be a government civilian, there are jobs that are posted. I'll throw the main website out there, USA Jobs, usually posts a lot of jobs so folks can scour that and see what they can come up with. So you can see how you can become a government civilian. And then the contracting agencies, when the service is needed, like strength and conditioning or athletic training or cognitive performance, the contracting agency who's awarded the contract by the government will post job advertisements through the normal mechanisms that you see them. So there are different ways to become involved. And we do see a lot of volunteer efforts that are going on that are able to derive funding from other sources, whether they be government grants or whatever the case may be. And then it's a kind of a community service project. So different ways. And I'll pause there because I know these guys have some different perspectives as well.
I'll just jump in for a second and just say I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Joe just said. But I also want to maybe briefly talk about some of the differences for those who aren't necessarily that familiar with the military between the active component and the Guard and Reserves. I think oftentimes when we think about the military, we think about the people who put on the uniform every single day, go to work, that's their full-time job. That's typically, and I'll allow others to correct me because I've never actually worn the uniform, but that's the active component, which really only makes up about 50% of our men and women in uniform. So the Guard and Reserves are the other 50%. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity, whether it's through some formal program that the Guard or Reserve have, which are not as formal. So when we talk about, for example, H2F, that's primarily being implemented within the active component, as Mark can discuss. Whereas in the Guard and Reserves, the resources haven't yet been allocated. And so it's sort of an unfunded mandate, which in some ways is a good thing. It does sort of create the opportunity for people to be creative. But establishing, so for example, as a very practical step, getting in touch with either a National Guard armory or the National Guard for your state, the leadership, and saying, hey, I'm here, I'm a professional, I'm happy to help. What can we do? Would be a phenomenal place to start. Because again, a lot of those individuals, the vast majority who are in the Guard and Reserves, they're not putting on the uniform every day. They're just going out, they may get deployed, but again, maintaining their ability to be deployed is just as important. And then the other piece I'll say too, is that once you become involved, it is important that you have some understanding of the culture. So we talk a lot about meeting people where they're at. And sometimes as exercise professionals who maybe haven't existed within a military environment before, it can be very foreign. I would say, and I'll really let the others speak to this. I wouldn't let that keep you from doing it. I would just say really embrace it and have conversations with soldiers. Go out on a march or a ruck with them. Do what it is that they're doing, so that you A, better understand it, and B, just begin to build relationship and rapport with them. And that by its very nature will allow you to be sort of the de facto subject matter expert who can really help and be a trusted source. So I'll end there and invite others to speak as well.
I would love that was actually the perfect segue to kind of the questions, I guess, to Mark and Nate in here. And kind of Joe kind of stated it as just like, look, you have different entry points into being kind of the solution, being a part of the solution. But it seems like now that would be a challenge with continuity. Like, how do you get everyone on the same page? So from Mark and Nate's perspective, I think when you talk about civilians that are coming in to kind of work in this field and others, how do you manage continuity now, like making sure you guys are on the same page? And maybe we'll start with Mark first, and then we'll go to Nate.
I think it goes back to the education piece from like my perspective as a director on Fort Liberty and a project officer within the Armed Forces Wellness Center. When we're bringing new individuals in, we have to train them to understand the clients, understand the soldiers in which they're working with, the DA civilians and stuff like that, because they have to understand those individuals and what their day-to-day looks like. You know, we teach needs analysis in all of our programming, classes, but we have to be boots on ground with these individuals, learning their day-to-day in and out to where we can sort of get to know them on a personal level, because we have to first, develop rapport with these individuals to where they respect us and understand our unique backgrounds. And then we can start moving that needle. I'll let Nate jump in on that one.
Yeah, I mean, to expand on that, I know everybody has the, nobody cares how much you know till they know how much you care. I believe Dr. Roy Sugarman, by way of Stephen Underwood, I'm stealing this one, which is you're not an expert without an invitation. So you have to earn that invitation, particularly in the military community. And so the first thing that you need to do is work to become culturally competent, which Dan already discussed some ways to start to do that right now. That said, I might give this opinion might not be shared by the group, but I actually don't think continuity is that important so long as everything we're pushing forward as a collective is a net positive, right? So we don't all need to be aligned and perfect and speaking the same language. I think the smaller the circle, the more continuity becomes extremely important. But I think as you start to grow that circle and think service wide, as well as the communities, the families, and everything else that comprises this holistic concept that we're talking about, as long as people aren't bringing information that's, literally detrimental to the force, then I think some co-opetition is certainly okay. I think some discrepancies between like, hey, if I'm a strength conditioning coach and I have an issue with CrossFit and I take this stand and that's the hill that I decide I want to die on, but that soldier that I work with is part of let's say a CrossFit box, and that's part of their community where they go to be active and they do it maybe even with their family and other families, then again, that's a net positive in my mind. And so my thought is, I think we need to let go of some of the control and some of the idea of like narrow and deep, and instead think like, how do I make just a 1% difference, or how do I contribute to a 1% difference across the entirety of the force? And so I think if we start prioritizing breadth over depth, we accept that that's going to come by a lot of different avenues for a lot of different folks, whatever resonates with them from a cultural perspective, and consider it a win.
Awesome. And I'll round it out to the one question for all of you, but make sure to our audience that please ask your questions. This is your opportunity to ask your questions to our folks here, and this is kind of like, this is a great opportunity for you to kind of learn from each other. I think that's a really cool thing. I guess it's like comes down to, I guess, putting my MBA hat on of return on investment. And you said you can't write a large enough check to do it. So when we're thinking about this, when we think about, is this investment worth it, and how do you know it's successful? So I'll give you the example of like cardiac rehab programs. And I had a really great talk with one of my colleagues, Matt Thomas. And one of the things he tracked as a cardiac rehab director, for example, is one of the KPIs or key performance indicators was getting readmitted back into the hospital. So we're able to calculate it's $37,000 for every readmission. So when we're thinking about that, it's just like that's the KPI that a cardiac rehab director tracks to go like, look, can we reduce the overall burden to Medicare, other payers by keeping them active over the longer course of time and to minimize the amount of readmissions? What KPIs do you all track to make sure that what you're doing for H2F and kind of looking at the holistic person, how do you know it's successful? So I guess it's like, I guess every the way you guys look at it is maybe have different angles, but I'd love to know, how do you know what you're doing is working? Nate.
I'll start on this, but I'm going to butcher it. So I'm also going to try to hand it to Dan and Joe as quickly as I possibly can. But one, Jimmy Smuda, an athletic trainer with U.S. Air Force Special Warfare Group, he just spoke at NSCA Tactical and gave an absolutely phenomenal, the best I've seen, breakdown of ROI. And really the way he did it was looking at a whole lot of things that cost time and then looking at what that time costs in terms of dollars for that specific operator. So things like, how long did it take that person, one, to determine that they even needed to be seen? Then once they decided to be seen, how long did it take them to be seen by a medical professional because they had access in-house versus if they did not? And then once they were seen, how long was it until they were back in the line? Well, when they access somebody in-house, right? So they decided to be seen sooner. They were seen sooner. They returned to duty faster. And so he broke that all down into dollars and showed the discrepancy between, hey, if we didn't have these assets in-house, what does that look like? Versus we have this team in-house. And the ROI, I don't remember the numbers, was astronomical, even if somebody is just looking at it purely subjectively from a time money standpoint. And then I'll pass it over.
Yeah, and I'm gonna defer for a minute too to Mark and Joe and maybe add something that might be a little bit different from what others may say.
Joe.
Okay. Yeah, I'd echo what Nate just said. Because really what we're looking at organizationally, we're looking at it from the larger level. And priorities can change at whatever level down to the individual, but organizationally you want deployability. That was always tracked at every level of organization. Do you have people who are ready to go do the job? And then I think Nate really hit on something. It was that downtime, those lost duty days. Because part of the deployability issue is, how long does it take you to get care? How long does it take you to get better? Because injuries occur sometimes just for the nature of the work. And so you want to avoid the avoidable injuries. You want to avoid the overreaching, the overtraining. You want to optimize health through proper nutrition, sleep, mental well-being. So really minimizing, the commanders really want the most ready force that they can. So two key things will come up: deployability and lost duty days. I'm trying to minimize both of those or improve both of those.
Thoughts?
So to sort of bounce off that, Joe made the comment, to be the most ready force available, and that's what the commanders want, right? So it's not just being in the formation. We have to look at the objective data. Yes, our Armed Forces Wellness Centers have done business case analysis that show that the return on investment for us being around is astronomical. We're saving money. We're returning soldiers back to duty, and that's great. But we also have to look at the subjective component too. When soldiers, when they come into us, we look at the outcomes data, right? We look at the individuals when they come in, we look at the outcomes when they come out. Are they losing the body fat? How does that make them feel? Are we looking at perceived stress? How do they feel when they're in the uniform? And is that actually impacting their day-to-day lives? Is it impacting their family? Is it impacting their financial, in a sense? Because it could. If they feel better, then they can actually do more in life. They could be going to school, furthering their education. They could actually be doing better with their jobs and get it promoted faster, which actually brings in a little bit more financial. So as we look, Dan talked about the total force fitness. Everything connects together. And I think that that's how we have to look at it on the return on investment, is everything touches each other. So we have to start looking at, how do we connect the dots? And then how do we push that up to everyone at the senior level to say, yes, we need more of this. And I'll leave it at that and let Dan finish it off.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Again, I agree with what everybody said. And the one other layer that I'll put onto this is, again, from sort of a public health perspective, is that we know that best practice in evaluation from the CDC on public health evaluation is that we not just look necessarily at outcome and impact, but also process. So we need to also not be afraid to look in the mirror when things aren't going well, so that we can assess what's happening. It's really referred to often as the black box phenomenon. It's like we know the plane went down, we know who was on board, we know where it went down. We don't have any idea why, because we lost communications. So you open up the black box and you get all this information, and that information comes through process evaluation, conversations, like kind of like Mark was talking about, not only maybe at the individual level, but at the unit level with those maybe holistic health and fitness teams and so on, so that you can start to get a sense for, well, why did H2F work, or whatever program it may be, work really well in this setting or with this brigade, didn't work so well over here. We had the same number of strength coaches, dietitians, what have you. So I would push strongly for, and again, this is a great opportunity to partner with academia, because we're not necessarily all evaluation scientists, but there are evaluation scientists in education, in higher ed. So it's a great opportunity to partner with higher ed to look at how you can develop a more robust process for evaluating things, because sometimes, quote unquote, ROI is equated with actual dollars, which is not a bad thing by any means. And it may take time before we actually see that literal dollar for dollar return on investment. But there are other things that we can be evaluating, again, in this process evaluation, that can demonstrate that why or how we're moving in the right direction, or why and how we're moving in the wrong direction, that we know are going to translate into dollar signs down the road.
Nate.
Yeah, with what Dan said regarding that it takes time, I just wanted to add one quick note. There's people often say like, hey, is H2F going to be successful? How do we know if it's successful? And what I always say is, for me, we won't truly know if it's successful, one, unless we evaluate the outcomes and the processes that drive them. But two, if we are willing to commit to this from the time that somebody, when H2F started, was literally just born, and then they are someday a 4-star general, that is the type of span that we need to be looking at. Somebody who has gone through the entire phase of everything, from how they were affected as a youth, from H2F being implemented across the military, to when they become the head honcho. And I think that if we're not willing to commit to that type of timeline to measure the positive or negative effects of H2F, then we're never going to know if it truly works.
All right, we got some questions, you guys, the last 8 minutes or so, and then I got a fun one to ask you all as well, for a personal question for you all to answer. I think the first one is the question is related to recruitment. Are there historical issues in the recruitment population characteristics, such as oral health or literacy, that might apply to today's issue? So it's just kind of looking at kind of the demographics and who you're recruiting.
I'll take that one briefly, and I may let others chime in here as well. Yes, there are a number of reasons for why an individual may be disqualified from service. What we have seen, however, is increasingly that, again, so oral health could be an issue, and it really depends upon how much need there is. You know, the standards will sort of vary a little bit. Oh, we'll take you if you've got tattoos, or no, we won't, or, you know, what have you. But what has increasingly become the really the number one disqualifier is, again, lack of fitness. So that's a trend that is changing. And I think one piece that I'd also like to highlight is that, at least within the United States, we've done some research that's demonstrated that from a recruiting perspective, what we see in recruitment challenges are also what we see reflected, again, in a number of the public health challenges. So I think many of us have heard of the stroke belt, which is a lot of the southern, southeastern states, which we know are disproportionately problematic from the standpoint of, you know, higher prevalence of heart disease, diabetes, and a number of other preventable conditions. Well, we've also done research that shows that recruits coming from those states are significantly less physically fit and significantly more likely to sustain a musculoskeletal injury. And those happen to be the states that are, quote unquote, the most patriotic, or the ones where we get the highest number of recruits from. So if we were going to target our efforts from a recruitment perspective, I would make the argument, and have made the argument, that we would target those efforts in the south and southeastern region of the U.S.
All right, 2 more questions that are coming in. So this one is really kind of related to kind of trailing or leading indicators of kind of like deployability. So deployability and lost duties are very latent variables or key performance indicators. Outcomes that are multifaceted and difficult to attribute to single program or interventions. So to Dr. Bornstein's point, what are the panel's point of view on the most important process KPIs with evidence related to outcomes? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, there's several outcomes that we've, kind of looked at, whether it be body composition, whether it be physical performance measures, that you test periodically. Really, as we're looking to the folks who may not necessarily be the elite performers, but the folks who can be fit enough to be in the force and can be, great contributors, if you can help them with their lifestyle changes or whatever that help them become the best version of themselves that they can be. So looking at recidivism on our body composition programs, where we've noted that folks will be on the body composition program and then be able to receive their education and the training and then come off the program and then seeing less recidivism. That's a little bit latent too, but you can see those things over the course of maybe a couple of quarters out of a year. We're also looking at quality of life measures and attrition as to why people decide to stay. And a lot of times it's like that command climate. And that can be partly related to what you're doing on this health and fitness side of things. If people feel like that the organization cares about them, then they tend to stay. And those views can be shifted rather quickly. So looking at attrition from the standpoint of how many people leave and why they may leave, because we can track that data, that does come out. But I would say that deployability isn't as latent as you would think. Deployability and lost duty days, because those can be very quickly impacted. Like Nate was describing, if it takes you 3 weeks to get in for an appointment to see the care provider that you need, then that's 3 weeks of lost duty days. Whereas if you have these folks with better access to care, then that can be 3 duty days or 4 duty days that folks may wait to be seen. So that's not quite as latent as you might think. And deployability is tracked monthly. And there are many factors that go into that. Again, so if we can take care of these acute things that we get out there with the force and help address, it's not just these long-term lifestyle changes, but those do contribute.
All right, the next one is, sorry, we have like the last 3 minutes. I want to get to one more question, and then Nate, once we answer, we can kind of go back because it looks like you want to kind of follow up with that one. And I'm going to butcher the acronyms here, so I'm not really sure exactly how to describe it. So should we introduce TFF into the JROTC programs? And should we expand the JROTC programs to reach the youth? That's the question.
I'll sort of tackle that one real quick with just a quick point. And I think that, I think the answer is yes. I think we should jump into, the total force fitness framework and reach the JRTC populations, but I wouldn't advise creating brand new programs for each JROTC. Utilize what you have close to you. There's a lot of Armed Forces Wellness Centers. There's a lot of military installations with current H2F teams. There's a lot of strength coaches and, registered dietitians who want to get out there and share their experience. So if you've got something close, utilize those resources. And then by that, you can implement, with the individuals that are in those programs. Again, going back to what I was saying, if their degree path aligns, you can educate them early on, and then they can reach the youth later. Dr. Bornstein, I think you were about to jump in.
I'll just say real quick, I would say yes. And so, implementing total force fitness or some iteration of it with junior ROTC programs is certainly not a bad idea. However, it may be necessary, but certainly not sufficient condition to meet the recruiting challenges that we have. So I think it's more broadly, it's implementing healthy, again, comprehensive health and wellness programs in DoD connected schools and DoD connected students. And then again, as Nate was talking about earlier, nationally among youth sport and on our schools overall.
Awesome. And I will leave it to you all to say, this is we have the last minute. Any parting words that you want to address to any of our organizations?
I guess I would just say thank you for everything that you do every day. And there are great opportunities for you to plug into specifically with military populations. And if you're not able or willing to do that, then again, you can make a huge difference by doing what you do every day in your local communities. So don't be afraid to be a champion for holistic health and fitness, however you define it, where you live, where you work, where you play, where you commute, where your kids go to school, and so on. That's it.
Awesome. I think that rounds out. We're at the top of the hour. I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. This is recorded. We're going to send it to everybody who's registered for the webinar. We're also going to put it on the Coalition for the Registration Exercise Professionals YouTube channel. It's going to be free for everybody to have it. Thank you all, Mark, Dan, Joe, and Nate for your invaluable insights, and look forward to continuing to work with you all together. Thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.